England are you from?
Well, I used to live in Garden City.
I lived in Setauket. I grew up in Setauket, which is out by Port Jefferson.
Yeah, I know. It's really nice out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I live in Shoreham, which is further out,
Oh,
not far from Setauket.
yeah, that's great. I haven't been back though in many years now.
Where are you now?
I'm in Salt Lake City,
Okay.
in Utah. Yeah.
So I see Margie's here today.
Hi,
Hi, Margie.
How you doing, Bruce?
How you doing?
Good, thank you. I came because of our dear friend Harold. Wanted to be here and hear you speak, Harold, tonight.
Oh, well, maybe to put you to sleep, you could get to sleep early, you know.
Well, we're thinking there might be a few people watching TV tonight, so
I
I'm gonna
tried
do
that.
another minute, and then we'll get.
Yeah,
get started.
you're competing against ex-President Obama tonight.
Yeah.
He's
know.
great.
That's rough.
The rest of it is.
That's pretty tough competition.
Yeah,
I'll take Dr. Hastings any day of the week.
I'll take Barack.
All right, I'm gonna have to tune out pretty soon because we won't be able to hear.
Yeah, I'm going on mute. Hi, Harold.
Okay, I'll go on mute so you don't have to hear my background noise. But basically, I have never heard Harold speak before, but he has one incredible resume. This speech is called "Networks Abound: Food Webs, Financial Networks, and the Power Grid: The Internet and Now COVID." Network theory is something that is probably not as well understood as it should be, which is why we have blackouts and pandemics, and people just don't want to believe. But Harold is going to clarify all that for us tonight. He teaches in the Division of Science, Mathematics, and Computing at Bard College in Simon's Rock, and he has taught mathematics. Oh, he went to Yale University. Oh my goodness, and Princeton. Holy smokes. Well, I think I'm just going to let him get started. So here we go.
Okay.
Dr. Hastings.
Let's see, here we go. This should work. And here we go. So I want to talk about networks. And I have just here, this was sort of, people were hanging out before the title slide, just a picture of a few networks. Food webs is where I got intrigued about this in the early 1970s, way back in the last millennium. Economics is essentially ecology plus money. In fact, three noted ecologists wrote a paper called Ecology for Bankers, where they explained that financial network collapse was kind of like food web collapse, and the power grid is an important network. And I don't know what's going on in California, that they're, we just don't seem to be able to supply enough. So this is the title slide. And of course, one of the secrets is to have good collaborators. Ty Young Taft at Simon's Rock and I have worked together on this for a number of years, and a bunch of virtual conferences this summer. So here are a bunch of networks. And as I say, I got intrigued about food webs. It was kind of exciting at the time, and questions about whether adding links in a network made it more stable or less stable. And then I just want to observe that epidemiology is the opposite of conservation biology. In conservation biology, you're trying to keep the stuff alive, and in epidemiology, you're trying to drive it to extinction. So in epidemiology, you're trying to make non-existence a stable state, and in conservation biology, you're trying to make existence and persistence a stable state. Let me say, if anyone has any questions, please interrupt, unmute and say something, and I'll pause periodically. I want to talk a little bit about dynamics and equilibria. And then I want to talk about a very simple picture of some network dynamics and that relates to how we're trying to prevent the spread of COVID. And then after that, I'm going to talk about network dynamics in general and what one might transfer from knowledge of one field to another. And I've been lucky in this is in doing the sort of math and computing side of having a lot of really good people to work with, and it's been very enjoyable. So a stable equilibrium, I'm showing a sort of marble in a bowl, and basically it rolls to a low point there. That's the notion of a stable equilibrium, that if I start near the equilibrium, I'll end up at the equilibrium. On the other hand, we have an unstable equilibrium. For example, balancing a yardstick vertically or just a ball on the top of a curved surface, and given the small push, it will fall off. So basically, what you're trying to do in networks is to make an equilibrium state for the whole system a stable state. You're trying to get, in some cases, the desired equilibrium. In epidemiology, people talk about an epidemic state and a low-level endemic state. So apologies for a little math, but that's the way it goes. I want to look at a growth rate, so I'll measure the distance from equilibrium. And basically, I'm going to think of a system which, if I were looking at a physical system, I'm doing some time-lapse photography at an appropriate interval. It might be days, it might be hours, it might be an annual sample of an animal population. It might be daily or smooth numbers of COVID cases breaking out. And basically, the growth rate, I'm asking whether the new distance from equilibrium is a multiple of the previous distance, and if the multiple is less than 1, then the difference, the distance from equilibrium, goes to 0. And if it's bigger than 1, the distance from equilibrium grows. And so if you're looking, for example, at the relationship of this with COVID, there's something called RT, which is essentially a growth rate for the number of cases. In Massachusetts now, it's about 0.85. But basically, if you have a stable equilibrium, then and I displace you, the distance from equilibrium shrinks. And if I have an unstable equilibrium, the distance grows. And I'm going to just think of R as a measure of it. If you want to think of a bank account, you can think of R as being 1 plus the interest rate. So at positive interest, the amount in the bank grows. And I guess the idea of negative interest is to encourage people to spend the money now, the negative interest that we've seen in some economies, because it will be worth less later. So I want to look a little bit at some empirical dynamics from COVID. So let me just give the disclaimers that I'm not an MD and I'm not capable of treating anything. And then the other disclaimer is that the data has changed a bit from time to time. So I'm looking at data from the New York Times, from a site at University of Washington called COVID-19.health data, and from RT Live. And if you look at the number of cases in Massachusetts, where's the dang cursor? Here it is. So things were low, and then kind of late March, they shot up to a high level, and it peaked and it came down, and then it was a darn slow decline. And now it's kind of oscillating a little bit. It's grown. If I take this a little further, it's shrunk a little. And down below is the graph from RT Live, and I've tried to superimpose the times. So the growth rate is bigger than 1 here, while the number of cases is going up. And then it fell less than 1 from a variety of distancing measures and masks and behavior changes. And then I guess at a low level with the reopening and maybe with people's behavior, it's hovered around 1. And if I just push this a few days later, it's now less than 1. Just a warning, these are all computed numbers and they're subject to a lot of variation. So this is just a picture of the dynamics. By the dynamics, I'm thinking as, you know, a mathematician or a computer modeler or someone just watching graphs. I'm not looking at how it's spread. I'm just looking at growth or decline in numbers of cases here. And so if you're trying to bring things under control, there are 2 concerns: that you have a small number of cases. This looked pretty good. So does this. And that you have a growth rate of it said, if you come from Hawaii to Massachusetts, you have to enter quarantine for a period of time. So Hawaii has had a growth rate in cases from a low level, and you can see here is a growth in the number of cases. And again, these are cases by testing. I mean, there's always a question of large numbers of cases that aren't found by testing. But I'm looking at the test data and the growth rate. And the growth rate has hovered around 1.2 for a while, meaning each case stimulates 1.2 new cases. And from what we know in nuclear physics, this is a chain reaction. This is a situation in which the number of cases just explodes. And so now there's about 12 cases per 100,000 per day. Massachusetts, it's 4 days. Now it's running more like 3 to 4 per 100,000 per day. By the way, a brief pet peeve, when they put numbers of cases in the newspaper, you know, Wyoming has a far smaller population than California or New York or Texas or Florida. They should really always quote cases per population level. So basically, this is a picture of a growth rate in Hawaii. This is a picture of a growth rate in Massachusetts. I'm sorry. And now you could try to ask what's going on. And if I had a flow of people from Hawaii to Massachusetts, then even though Massachusetts had a situation where the pandemic would die out in Massachusetts because the growth rate is less than 1, there's this tiny 0.97 that you don't see, and it's gotten less. The cases from Hawaii would continue to seed cases in Massachusetts. And as a personal experience, and some people read about it, there was the Biogen COVID meeting in Boston that managed to scatter cases around the nation. And for a little while, we were a hotspot in the nation. What's not working? Let's clear the drawings. And let's see if I can go to the next slide. Why is it? Is this one of these cases where it's there we are. So what does this have to do with networks? I want to talk a little bit about networks and questions of network dynamics as a way to understand some of the restrictions that have been put in. So just by virtue of pictures, so If you look, there are now travel restrictions around the world. People from the US can't travel to much of Europe. There are various restrictions within Europe. This was the picture in Massachusetts of the low-risk states from which you're allowed to travel to Massachusetts without a quarantine or a test, and the high-risk states. Now, what a number of states have done, Massachusetts, the New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, tri-state area, and probably a number of others, to my knowledge, has said, this is our case rate, and if you're from a state with a significantly higher case rate, we will require that you quarantine on traveling. And just again, a remark on its measurement, Massachusetts criterion says we want a case rate of less than 6 per 100,000 per day, and we want less than 5% of the population you're testing to test positive. So you can't just turn off testing and pretend the cases aren't there. So I want to just look at a toy model and ultimately get to an area where we can try to look at this. So a tale of two cities, with apologies to Charles Dickens. Our memories from high school, way back, I think many of us have. There's Redville in red with R of 1.1, and I'm going to say there are 1,000 cases, and I have it growing at a rate of 1.1. So those 1,000 cases generate 1,100, and let's assume they die out, and then 1,210, and so on. And in Greenville, the disease dies out, R is 0.9. So you could model this very easily. If you're sitting for a model on your computer, well, you probably just use a spreadsheet now, or you use R, or use something, and just for Redville, you look at the number of cases, and from this R, you can compute a growth rate from the incubation time and stuff. And when you're done, you'll have a forecast of the number of cases in the future. And you could do the same in Greenville and look at the progression in cases. And in effect, although there are very fancy models, there's the SEIR model, susceptible, exposed, infected, and removed. Removed meaning no longer susceptible, either immune or passed away. And those models have some nonlinearities in them. A linear picture works pretty well for understanding what's going on. So here's the tale of two cities, and the importance then in trying to get the disease to die out. Now suppose there's a link. So mathematically, this picture I have could be called a graph or a network. There are nodes and there are links. So a power grid is a network. The nodes are either generating sites or consumption sites. And the links are the wires carrying power from one site to another. Food web in ecology, or more generally in an ecological community, each node corresponds to a name of a species, and the links represent interactions between pairs of species, whether they're a competition or eating or whatever. The internet, I guess, I mean, we all know we're nodes on the internet, there are addresses and so on, and there's a lot of wires around that are fiber connecting things. So this is just a picture of adding a link, and I'm going to label things. So I'm going to say, suppose each case in Redville generates 0.1 case in Greenville on average. So this might be by people from Redville going to Greenville in some other sort of mixing between the populations in the two cities, so we can label the links. And again, in other situations, you could have nodes and nodes labeled. In the World Trade Network, you have links that represent the quantities of goods flowing between countries. And you can in fact have many links if you're going to break it down to the different goods, or you could just look at dollar values for balance of trade. But mathematically, we have a structure that we can call a graph or a network. And now we'll look at the math of what happens. And if I put this in, so I now will update the population in Greenville by taking the change in the number of cases. The 1,000 generate 900 new ones, but the 1,000 in Redville contribute to 100 new cases in Greenville. So if you look at doing the math, what happens is the number of cases in Greenville starts to grow exponentially, tracking the number of cases in Redville. Okay? So even though the disease is dying out in Greenville, if I have a higher and higher flow from Redville, the number of cases will start going up in Greenville. So what you might think here, and we can look a little bit at the math a little more and kind of network, is if I cut the link, if I just cut the link, the disease will die out in Greenville. And I can think actually of cutting the links on many, many scales. I can think, for example, of bubbles. So typically within a family, one goes around unmasked and one does normal things and so on with people living together. But I know when I've entertained people up here, it's masked and on the deck, or if we're eating some distance apart, and you know, things are plated and there's no common serving bowl and stuff. So basically, maybe the bubbles are coming together, but we're trying to reduce the link between the bubbles. And on a larger scale, if a state or a country limits travel from another state or country, or quarantines or whatever, you're again trying to cut the flow in and thus allow the disease to die out in an area where it would die out without additional cases coming in. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in all the colleges. Simon's Rock is due to reopen with a fair bit of in-person instruction a week from Monday. And so far, we've had 0 cases among students coming into the campus. We're pretty proud of that. The other just note that I'm not going to get into here is if the number of cases is small enough, contact tracing, rapid testing, whatever is a way to deal with it. If the number of cases is very large, not only do hospitals get overwhelmed, but your ability to track where the infection is gets overwhelmed. So here's just a picture of the math. And what I want to do is say that we can write down models to discuss. So if you're afraid of math, hopefully you won't be too afraid. If you're really afraid, you could close your eyes for a few minutes, and I'll tell you when we've gotten away from it. But basically, what we can do is we can take a matrix where, for example, if I look at what's going on in Redville as the first column, it's got a growth rate and a flow. Let's see, it looks like there's a mistake in the slide. Just give me a second. Yeah, the first, it's the flow. Yeah, it's the growth rate in Redville, and it's the flow from Redville to Greenville. This should be reversed. Well, despite what you may have heard from professors, no one puts mistakes in to see if people are awake. So what I've done here is I've represented the number of cases in Greenville and Redville. Redville's on top, Greenville's below, and I've got a matrix multiplication that lets me do the update.
So can I ask a question about this, if I may?
Sure.
So a little confused by the flow rate. I get 1.1 times 1210 is 1331, I guess. But when you take 0.1 times those people and send to Greenville, shouldn't you decrement the number of people in Redville then?
Well, that would be true if I were sending people or money, but I'm assuming they're just transmitting the disease.
Oh, okay. So this is the
So
model.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So as it turns out, and so let me just say a little bit about that. If I'm looking at a trade network measured in money, for example, if country A buys $1 billion worth of goods from country B, then country A ships $1 billion to country B in return for the goods, and I've decremented country A and incremented country B. So that puts a kind of symmetry in the network. If I look at a power grid, basically if there's a flow from a generator in one place to a source in another, then I look at the amount of energy in where I'm generating it is decremented, and the amount of energy where it's consumed is, used for something else, is the amount of electrical energy is increased. So I'm simply considering the spread of the disease as opposed to the spread of people. Okay, I mean that
makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And so, for example, my older son and family are down in Bethesda, Maryland, and I visited them and came back before Massachusetts had put the curfew down. When I was back here, the number of people in Massachusetts, at least I didn't change it. I mean, probably people were born in the state and died in the state, moved in and out. But I had made a round trip. As it turns out, we did not transfer any disease to Massachusetts. But had, for example, I gotten infected in Maryland, I would have brought a case back to Massachusetts. So the point is that if I want to update, I just multiply by a matrix, and I can get a matrix of flows. And if anyone's thinking about programming, matrix multiplication is pretty easy to program, and it provides a simple way to update, as long as the system is obeying the rules, as long as, say, typically the fraction infected is less than 10% or some number like that. At some stage, you have to bear in mind that people recover from the disease and then are typically immune for a period of time. Now, before, let me anticipate a potential question. If you look at what's going on in various states, people's behavior also changes through time. And it's of interest to me that whenever the rate of new cases exceeds roughly 50 or 60 per 100,000 per day in a state, suddenly it starts falling off, I believe, from behavioral changes. So I'm thinking here that the behavior is constant if I have the same matrix. If I want to think of behavioral changes, I could change the matrices through time. What I'm saying is I just make a grid. Let me see if I'll make a grid here. Let me temporarily go back to the very first slide. I take a grid. Here's the trade network, for example, and I label each link with a flow. And then I write down the countries in order, and I write down all the flows, and I get a matrix, and I can update the state of the system with the matrix. You know, a little care in economics. If you've seen it, it's called the Leontief model. Doesn't really matter for what we're doing here. If I have energy flows, I update again with the matrix.
Not sound plastic.
So let's see.
No, that's.
So
This is
here's just a picture of
we said it would
a question of of adjusting the network. I didn't want to say anything bad about any state. There is no state with a two-letter abbreviation QW. And
Yeah, but at night it's more strain on the whole network usually. But apparently it's okay.
Look, Tanya, it sounds like
Sorry.
Can everybody except the speaker please?
go ahead. We'll talk about strain on network a little later. I'm muted. I'm supposed to do something to unmute. What do I do? Where is it?
we can hear you.
Oh, okay. But I have a black thing across the screen. Do you see it?
No, I mean,
Okay. So here's a picture. I want to note that if I have a growth rate in one state, it can drive exponential growth rates in other states. I haven't put the links in here, but then if I put a travel restriction and say, for example, that you're allowed to freely travel among New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and you're not allowed to enter these states from state QW, then I can prevent or at least delay a growth of the number of cases in Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut. So what you're doing is taking the picture before, and there might be lots of links. Again, flows potentially of disease carried by travelers in each direction. One of the problems with this disease is that you don't know that you are infected necessarily. You may not know at all, you may not know for a period of time, but you could have all these links here. And each link could represent a flow state to state. You could represent all of this by a matrix, by the number of cases that, for example, that each case in New York brings to Massachusetts or vice versa. And there is certainly commuting New York to Connecticut. I live just 5 miles from the New York state line. And so, I mean, there are people who work where I work who are in New York State and travel back and forth. So there would be some of these flows here. And then by going, and I have to do a bunch of things. I have to get rid of that. Oh, and I agree. This is the one of the, I have to clear all the drawings. And then I think I can go down. And I have to clear the annotate capability. There. By, for example, saying you're allowed to travel within the green circle, but not to and from state QW, I have no flow of cases here. This is equivalent to putting zeros in the matrix that represents the flows. So I want to just give a brief summary up to now. Number one, we can quantify the spread by a matrix model by saying, if you give me the growth of cases in any location, as well as cases brought from one location to another, spread of the vector, spread of the disease, you can quantify it by a matrix model. You'd like to get a stable equilibrium at 0, no disease. And this depends on some sort of growth rate. And there's a word eigenvalue missing. But if I take matrices, they have a growth rate associated with the matrix that's like the number R. So basically, I can look at the matrix and actually ask whether I will have a stable equilibrium at 0 or not. If I get to where there's a stable equilibrium at 0 In other words, if the cases all die out, then if a case comes in, there'll be a local outbreak, but it will die out. This is behind the idea that if you can get the situation working right, you can ease up on restrictions and say if a few cases come in, the outbreaks will be local and we can control them. And I want to note that many other systems can be described by matrix models. And I want to look at a notion that came up in power grid part of matrices called
Can I ask you about that before you get on?
Oh, sure.
So yeah, so I guess maybe the way you set the problem, it's almost self-fulfilling, right? I mean, it's a linear model, you know, that there's a factor, and it's like, well, you're kind of presupposing it could be modeled that way. It's not necessarily the case, right? This could be a simplification. It could be nonlinear, right?
It is nonlinear in the long run, but it's linear near zero. The models that people are using can be linearized.
You know, I know that's a general engineering approximation people make that near a certain point it can be linearized, right?
Yeah.
I guess that's true, but I guess it's almost like you're stating this like a mathematical proof, right? Rather than an estimating technique.
Well, I could say two things. Number one, when we get into a general theory, it actually holds for nonlinear models with a modification. And number two, if I'm really looking at getting this, if I'm looking at a situation where, let's see, how does the disease spread from an infected person to a susceptible person? Well, they have to meet, they have to come together. So I have like a mass action thing, like chemistry. I have something that says in the standard model used, I try to approximate the likelihood of transmission in an interaction, and the number of interactions is proportional to both populations. Well, if the number of susceptible people decreases by 3% or 5%, it's not a huge change. So yes, you're right, it is an approximation, but it could, it's reasonable if you're looking at a stable equilibrium at zero, then you could linearize it. And B, you can actually write down a nonlinear version of this and get a similar picture. And I'm simply not doing that due to time and simplicity limitations.
Okay.
And let me say one more thing. It's sort of an interesting history. I'm going to mention something about failures. And between 1955 and 1972, there was a lot of excitement in coming up with different explanations of whether you make it more complicated, whether you make it more stable or not. And that was all linear stuff. And then around 2005, Sinha said, well, this works for nonlinear models too. You just have to interpret it right. And I will admit I was very skeptical, but a bunch of very smart people came up with proofs and explanations. So it's a good point, yeah. And one of the limitations is how accurately you can get some of these parameters. But the general principle of either cutting links or cutting growth rates can hold, and you can then look at a sort of benefit of it. So I'm going to look at cascading failure in the power grid. In 2003, on August 14th, 2003, I was living on Long Island then. 10 after 4 on a Friday afternoon, all the lights went out. I had actually just left work. Unfortunately, I wasn't in an elevator. Well, surely the power will come on in an hour or two. I mean, what's the big deal? It goes out and they put it back on. It's hot. It's not extremely hot. If anyone was around in the Northeast then and remembers, I think it was 87 degrees. Howard, you were around on Long Island then. Others, I mean, it was a little hotter than a typical August day, but not crazy. And it turns out that basically power flows cascaded, and I want to look at a concept of cascading failure in timescales, and then try to relate this to networks. So this is a picture just before the blackout began. And what you can notice is there are areas where you're in rough balance. So New York is 28 gigawatts of load and 27 generation. There are areas that are well out of balance. There are areas down here, Dayton Power and Light, and this region, they're generating, they're in very close balance, but they're shipping power out, 3 gigawatts out here, 1.6 out here. So even though they're in close balance, there's large flows in the network. This is 3:05 p.m. August 14th. So this is what I mean by a cascading failure. I'm not intending that one can read all the fine print on the slide, but what I want to note is there's a series of events between 12:15 and a little after 4 p.m. where things started to go wrong and were controllable. And what happened is gradually the system became overloaded as a variety of lines controlled by First Energy in the Midwest began to fail. And it turns out the analysis, the later study says, if you had simply modified the network by a small a reasonably large shutdown in Cleveland, Akron, in the middle of this, you could have probably averted the blackout then. And now I want to look 4:09 p.m. to 4:13. And really by from 4:10 to 4:13, the next 3 minutes were a host of failures at a rapid time scale where the New York lost it, Ontario lost it, parts of Ontario lost it here, Cleveland, Pennsylvania link broke. Basically, lots of failures are cascading at a rapid scale, too fast to react. And the scale of reaction depends on how fast you can get the information and respond to it. So this was the next 3 minutes in the blackout. A sort of small bit of personal story. The local newspaper's called Newsday, and I had worked with them a little bit as a consultant on science, and they tried to locate me that weekend. I was actually up here in New England. We came up here, and they wanted a quote that people were using too much energy. And I refused to give it to them, so it never appeared. I said, I'm sure it's due to greed. And smarter people than I have studied it and shown how there were a series of failures earlier, and had one made some small cutbacks, reducing in the loss of income, one probably could have averted the major failure. Now, I don't know if this is going to play or not. There it goes. So what you have on the left is a graph showing large fluctuations from normal. They're plotting the frequency. And basically, if you try to run a generator, you've got to synchronize everything. And if your frequency falls off, you can't synchronize it. And if you put too much load in a place, well, gee, there's more resistance than force. From my knowledge of intro physics, and I don't want to go into any electrical engineering that I don't know, things slow down. So you have a series of small events, and suddenly, these are all cases where the fluctuations are dying out. You sort of have some amount of control, but you're beginning to lose it as the frequency drops below 60 hertz. And now what you see looks like waves of almost anything spreading through the region. As it turns out, the blue areas are drops in frequency. There are areas where you're not keeping up with the power, but this could just as easily be the spread of a disease or anything else that's now circulating around the region. it looks like things are temporarily stabilized, but it's really an unstable equilibrium or a metastable equilibrium. You'll notice a lot of blue. You're not where the system should be operating, and suddenly all heck breaks loose. Around the Lake Ontario, it stops. And the key is that the spread through the network is occurring much faster than the reaction time. So this was beyond humans to control, probably starting at around 410, maybe earlier. So just a side remark to COVID, all this question of test results, if I could get test results back in
Harold?
15, yeah.
Just from a system point of view, I don't know whether you know this or not, but is this a bunch of people from the different power companies calling one another? Or is it all just happening without any human intervention? I mean, are they calling up and saying, hey, would you please shut off your power grid somewhere? And the guy says, no way, I'm not gonna be the guy that does that, or?
I think by the end, there was too fast for human communication. But you raise a key question, and it's an interesting question. At what stage do you cut yourself off rather than, maybe I could supply enough to save the grid, but I'd have a risk of going down. At what stage do I try to save my utility by cutting off an excess flow of power? And can I save it while it's still relatively stable? So there's a later slide which actually looks at this in an analog. If you've ever done any hiking over steep terrain, challenging, slippery, and so on, if it's a gentle slope, you just walk. If it reaches some level of steepness or iciness, everyone ropes in. If there are 4 of us hiking and 3 of us could easily save one person who slips, then we all stay roped in. On the other hand, if it gets really steep, the optimal strategy is not to rope in, because at that stage, what would end up happening is one person slipping would bring everyone down. And the power grid one that I'm familiar with, when I was in college and we're having dinner, and someone yells, we gotta all go to the TV room. The whole Northeast is blacked out. Well, I was in New Haven, which had cut off from the Northeast grid in time, and we had power. And somehow the TV stations in New York were transmitting on some emergency power. So we were seeing all these college kids, these great pictures of darkness. New York is dark, Boston is dark. I mean, it was just, everything died out.
This is the 1970s, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
I think I should accelerate a little. But I don't want to go too fast. So just, let's see, we're sort of near the end. A model of what makes it stable. So there were 2 competing theories. Grant Evelyn Hutchinson and Robert MacArthur said, you give me more links. This is a picture from Bob MacArthur's paper in ecology, in a food web, and that stabilizes it. Essentially, I build many parallel circuits for energy to flow. If you've driven around New York and you've driven around California, in New York, there are lots of parallel roads. So maybe Interstate 495 goes down, but there's several other roads that won't make it perfect, but it won't be a total failure. If Interstate 80 goes down out of San Francisco on many sections towards Sacramento and onto Nevada, you're stuck. There's no alternative. So if you have many parallel routes for energy flow, that would help. The complexity implies stability. Whereas on the other hand, it's possible that the many routes could provide a means for failure, like a house of cards. And I want to talk a little bit about modularity and scaling rules and getting around this. Here's a house of cards failing. I'm sure a lot of you have tried to do this at times as a kid. You build it up and you build it up, but here a single failure brings it down. And when I add more cards, I typically am not sharing the stresses across the system. So I'm providing more modes of failure. Whereas MacArthur, to me, is more like I go to the supermarket. Okay, I wanted to buy squash today, but they don't have any squash. They have broccoli. I'll buy the broccoli. I'm a generalist on food, so I can deal with a certain failure. And in answer to an earlier question, there's a comment on nonlinear extensions here. So there's a failure at a rapid rate, cascading through the network. And we could ask, what makes a network stable? I mean, the internet is exceptionally stable. The power grid is pretty darn stable. Logistics, don't know. And the key is that if you have more interactions, as long as interaction strength decreases fast enough, that will make it stable. So if the interaction strength is nearly constant, you have the house of cards. And if it decreases fast enough, you get it stable. So it turns out there's a theory that developed. And here's a picture of a network with lots of connections. I'll tell you what it is in a minute, and we'll talk about its stability. Well, what Bob May did is they quantified the notion. You could have a network with too many vertices, too many nodes. It could be too connected. I could have interactions that are too strong. And what I'm looking at in this picture, is actually the core of the US financial network with a bunch of things on the side. So people got a way to try to measure the correlations in the network. And a certain amount of work says that the linear theory can be applied to nonlinear systems, again, as an approximation. So I want to comment a little bit on COVID dynamics. And this is some work in progress with Tai Young Taft, and to say we've got a model that's linearized. We've made some simplifying assumptions. By the way, what we're doing is very similar to the model out of University of Washington. And then what I'm doing is putting in a bunch of realistic dynamics. I don't want to really say much about the math other than the notion of super spreaders came up in work of Bob May and Roy Anderson in networks and led to the control of HIV before there was a successful treatment for it. They didn't drive it to zero. They didn't enable people to live with it, but they managed to slow down its rate in the US by targeting super spreaders, people with lots of sexual partners, at the San Francisco bathhouses before there were the current treatments that have changed it from an acute problem to a chronic thing that people can live with a long time. And then what one is really looking at is a question of modularity. Yeah. If I look at the power grid, or I look at the financial system, what I can try to do is set it up so that a failure in one point does not cascade to a failure in another point. By the way, letting Lehman fail was a gigantic error because everyone behaved the same way. Suddenly there was no freedom in the network and the financial system seized up. And you had the thing cascade through the system. The power grid, one would hope that we have ways to decide at what stage you need to cut out. And typically the question is operating with a reserve. And what I want to look at here in the spread, and I will think of this as a cascading spread through the US. This is CDC data as reported in Business Insider. And things look pretty good in January, just a few cases in Washington. We didn't have any real spreading or restrictions. We let it go through. March 16th, a number of states had put various restrictions on. I remember being very disappointed that in early March, a planned short trip to Denver to give a talk at the actually to listen to a student of mine giving a talk at this meeting, because I wasn't sure I'd be able to go. And then I thought, well, I'll go. And then I learned Sunday that the meeting Monday is called off. And no, I'm not going to Denver. You all can guess where my student was. He said, I'll go out for the full week. He was in Denver already, enjoying himself. But as you can see, it's spread through the US. These pictures are a week apart. And the relevant time scale here is the order of 4 or 5 days of an incubation period typical. Testing results in many cases don't come back quickly. I'm not really able to react faster than the time scale if it's spread. So I have a cascading failure. And so one of the roles in containing the spread is to cut connections and to do your testing and reaction on a scale that's fast enough that you catch the cases before they spread. Picture of modularity. I can try to contain things by cutting links. I just have to show this. It's completely irrelevant to the dynamics, but it gets the point across that a failure can cascade. If one person slips, they can bring other people down. And just in practice, network theory lets us think about modularity, whether it's COVID or whether it's the power grid, and one can even think about modularity in economic and other systems. And that has led to the field of network science. And with that, I want to thank everyone for their patience and forbearance, and I'll hang on to take questions. And I want to thank Bruce for having this series together. It's just wonderful. And I want to even thank him for putting it at 6:30 Pacific, because it means those of us on the East can have a leisurely dinner. And you know, we stay up a bit late, but there's plenty of time to get ready.
Thank you, Harold.
That R number that you're talking about, Harold, is that per day?
That I believe is case to case. That's not a growth rate per day.
Okay, all right.
And as I say, it's a highly estimated number. In fact, one of the problems with this whole thing is that I think everyone agrees that the number of cases is far, far higher than the number that are reported. And in one of my reactions, although I have the good grace not to do it, but if you promise not to tell anyone, I'll tell you about wanting to give some people a dope slap. It recently came out, I think, in The Lancet, which is a British analog of the New England Journal of New England Journal of Medicine. It's their big thing. That they think the number of cases among kids is as higher than the number of cases among adults. And I feel like saying, you should have thought of this. If they don't have symptoms, they're not going to the doctor. They're not getting tested.
Right.
And in many cases, you need to have symptoms to get a test. So, I mean, this idea that somehow they don't get it and their naive immune system, which makes them more susceptible to lots of things, makes them less likely to get the disease. I'm not talking about the reactions to it, but less likely to get infected. Gee, that just doesn't make any sense. And you feel like they should take a dope slap for not understanding that maybe that's what's going on, and maybe you could deal with it. I don't know how many of you were around the New York area in the West Nile outbreak that got a lot of people kind of worried.
Yeah,
and
I remember that.
It was a hot area. And they actually did a test in a block about 10 miles from where Howard and I lived in Queens County, in actually more than a block, in an area there, and found 30% of the people had developed antibodies. For most of us, you may well have gotten West Nile and had no symptoms, or, you know, darn, I have a slight cold, I'm not feeling good today. And so, I mean, one of the challenges is you may have a theory of what I want to do is cut certain links or adjust behavior or whatever, but if I get the data on too slow a rate to react, I'm stuck.
Yeah, so I mean, an event that could change all of this would be everybody going back to school, right?
Yeah,
So-
that's a very complex scenario. It could, but there's an argument that having, if someone's going to work, if their kid is in school, maybe they're primarily in one bubble, and you can do a better job of isolating than if they're in school 2 days and in this daycare center 1 day and here somewhere else. Now, it's all very, very complicated. And I don't have any answers. And I think the empirical data on the schools is highly mixed. Some countries brought people back, others didn't. Some brought them back and they had no problem. Others brought them back and they had big problems. You know, I think a large part of the question is, are you able to monitor and react fast enough? And is the number of cases small enough that you're okay? And so in New York State and Massachusetts, there, I'm familiar with it. There are some guidelines, and I don't have any way to judge the numbers, but they make sense to me as saying if the case rate is this low and I'm doing this amount of testing, I'm safe reopening the schools. And then, I mean, the real crux is that what I'm really interested in is not per se the COVID mortality or morbidity rate, but the overall rate in the US or in some other country. In other words, if saving one COVID death were to cause 2 other deaths, to me, that's not a win. I'm interested in all cause stuff. And I don't have enough information to answer this well. And then there are a lot of sociological, behavioral issues of what's going on.
To understand it better, you need more tests and you need the results in a timely way. The result of the test has to come fast enough.
Yeah, and in fact, there's 2 interesting papers in this regard. One is that a number of groups have developed tests that are reasonable as screening tests. Public health, I think they have a certain number of false negatives, essentially some high-speed chemistry antigen tests that will give you a result in 15 minutes, more or less the time scale of a home pregnancy test on your saliva. And the other is a paper out of the Yale group, Yale Public Health and Harvard Medical School, that says that if I can test every other day and get the results back reasonably, even if my test has a low sensitivity, frequency of testing is what you need from a public health standpoint to determine whether it's safe to maintain a school or some other thing in operation. And for any of us in engineering or who have driven in traffic knows the delay in getting it back has little to do with the time that the chemistry runs and everything to do with the backlog at the lab. California, I remember one horrible trip across the Bay Bridge when I made the mistake of landing not long before the rush hour in San Francisco and heading out to Brother and Davis, and a 3-hour wait to get across the Bay Bridge. I mean, we only spent a few minutes on the bridge, but the bridge had a small capacity and a lot of people wanted to get across. And so, I mean, this is, you need this. I mean, anyone in control theory knows I can't control a system if I don't have timely data.
Right.
And if I want to control a system, her memories of Kalman filters, I don't do too bad a job from a linear Bayesian strategy of controlling a system. I know how to use my priors to update test results and get a reasonable estimate of the state of the system. And in fact, early autopilots, which used a Kalman filter to figure out what's going on, did better than typical pilots at landing a plane or stabilizing a plane in unstable flight when they were doing first experiments in World War II. I know about this because my father worked on it during World War II.
Hey, Harold, that's a good segue because next week, Dagmar Kinney is going to be talking to us about something to do with airplanes. Are you on, Dagmar?
Yes. He's muted though.
Yeah,
so
I am on, and yes, and it'll be about reverse engineering a piece of a helicopter.
Wow,
Cool.
that's really neat. Yeah.
Yep.
No, I mean, the thing I know is that, right, the old planes were designed to be intrinsically stable. You paid a cost and drag.
Mm-hmm.
And now my understanding is the Airbuses and the 777s and stuff are all designed to be neutrally stable and computer stabilized, and that fighter planes are actually designed to be unstable so that they can react quickly. And then there's a question of artificially stabilizing them. But there's been a fair amount of work from network theory on trying to build better power grids, and a bunch of intriguing results that I don't fully understand out of Jürgen Kurth's group in Germany on stabilizing power grids. And in the financial system, I mean, one can sort of ask what happened, because when people added interactions, typically through derivatives and other sorts of elaborate things, and the interaction strength actually grew with the number of interactions. And so it's no surprise they were unstable. I commend you to read something in Liar's Poker, where they were talking about putting an option on some part of German currency, and the argument to the Germans had to be that this would not destabilize things and would allow people to trade and hedge German currency stuff. And of course, as they pointed out, the goal was exactly to provide a hedging option, but also a giant trading option, which suggests destabilization. And I, for one, will be fascinated by helicopter stuff, because my little bit of understanding is that they are much harder to fly than ordinary, regular airplanes.
Dagmar has a gold medal in flying helicopters, right?
Well, it's a bronze medal, not a gold medal. Yes, I do.
But it's a medal.
And
that's great. That's wonderful.
Yes, and talking about your stable and unstable example earlier, that's actually how you are exposed. So in airable system, so if you get helicopter, that is an inherently unstable system. So if you let go of the controls, literally within minutes, you become you have a situation of unrecoverable problems, and so which spawns two completely different types of pilots. The airplane pilot is more a manager and looking forward. The helicopter pilot has to have eye-hand coordination at all times. So if something goes wrong, you hang on and you fly that thing all the way to the ground.
Wow. Well, it's getting. I promise to try to keep these things close to an hour, so I think we probably should stop. Harold, thank you so much. I think some people probably got on this thing and didn't even know that network theory existed. Others of us were really curious to see how they're all related, and I learned a great deal. So thank you so much. And
yeah, this is
we can
very
hear from you
interesting.
again.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
I'm looking forward to next week.
Thank you, Harold.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harold.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good.
Night.